If we were to actually get every kid to graduate from college, you would need a college degree to be a janitor.
Bryan Caplan, welcome to AEI.
Thanks so much for having me.
So your book, The Case Against Education, Why the Education System is a Waste of Time and Money, makes you sort of a popular guy, maybe with an unpopular argument. How's the reception so far?
Well, it's not that unpopular, so maybe because the book's only $20 on Amazon, I've been moving a lot of copies, and I've been getting some very fair reviews. People criticize me, but at least they criticize me for what I said, so I got no complaints.
Okay, that's fair. All right, well, let's jump right in. So, you start off in the book and you talk about sort of three things that education communicates to employers from three perspectives. Can you just sort of break those down for us?
Yeah, sure. I say it's a package of three big traits. So first of all, intelligence, just that your education shows how smart you are. Secondly, it also shows how hardworking you are, because you could be really smart, but if you're really lazy, you're not going to be able to finish high school, much less college. And then last and least obviously, I say it signals conformity. It shows that you are willing to submit to social expectations, that you're willing to be an obedient little sheep, right? Which, of course, society needs obedient little sheep a lot of times, because if everyone were a free thinker and free spirit, how would anything get done?
Hold on a second. You've got this all wrong. So, I learned in graduate school this human capital theory, right? Mm-hmm. Human capital theory. We go to more years of schooling and we get more benefits. And that, when I go out on a job market, they're going to say, yeah, that guy's got more years of schooling, so that's why I go to school. Am I wrong?
Well, what you said isn't literally wrong, but so the whole idea of human capital theory is that education pays because school pours useful skills into you.
Right.
So you actually learn how to do a job better.
Right.
And I don't deny that occurs sometimes. So literacy and numeracy are very useful skills, and if you go to school to learn computer programming or something like that, then you really are emerging as a more skillful person, and it makes sense for employers to prefer you. But I still say there's a lot of education where they aren't teaching you very much, or at least it's not very relevant to any job you would ever do, and yet employers still seem to care. Like, why do employers care if you failed your foreign language classes, even though the people who got A's don't speak the language either?
Right.
Right? And I say the reason is that when you do well in school, you are sending a message to employers. You're saying, look, I'm the kind of person who has the package of brains, diligence, and conformity to go and jump through all these hoops, so at least don't throw out my application when I apply for the job.
Right. So in your book you say, let's see, I have it in here. You say signaling, which is this theory around signaling, has been kept in a ghetto, and this book's goal is to first emancipate it from the ghetto. So why has it been in the ghetto?
Right. So there are multiple Nobel Prize winners that have worked on this idea that part of why education pays is just that you're impressing employers, you're getting certified, you're getting a stamp on your forehead. There's one economist, Michael Spence, he really got his Nobel Prize entirely for this idea. But the strange thing is that people who look at the real world, right, so in what we call empirical researchers, people who study actual schools, actual education, the actual labor market, have never been very fond of this idea. And they treat it, yeah, sure, there is this idea, but we're just going to focus on going and measuring the payoffs for education. And it really bugged me because on the one hand, there's this explanation that seems to make a lot of sense, but the people who look at the real world don't talk about it very much. And I wanted to go and bring theory and reality together. And that's really what this book is all about, where I tried to say, look, there's actually a lot of empirical evidence, a lot of evidence in the real world that signaling is a big part of what's going on in education. It's a big part of the reason why it pays. And actually, there's a lot of facts that you really just can't explain without signaling. If you didn't believe in signaling, the world would just make no sense at all.
All right, so we have a human capital theory which says kids are learning more and that's why education is value. And then we have a signaling theory that says, we have these sort of credentials basically. It hinges on credentials. And those credentials are signals that folks who are hiring in the labor market say, well, I see that signal, so I know this quality. Sure. And these aren't independent. And it seems like your argument is certainly a step beyond signaling. It's about empty signals. Is that fair?
Well, so if you convince people that you were great by learning a lot of useful skills, then human capital and signaling would be almost the same thing. Right. But one of the big puzzles that I talk about in the book is, why do we spend so much time learning subjects that almost no one uses on the job? Almost no one has a job that uses history or social science or art or music or foreign language. Right? Just think about all the classes that you took where you never use them again after the final exam, and yet employers care. If you were to say, look, I only did the classes that I thought were useful, now give me a job, most employers would not say, they're good thinking. Instead, they wouldn't even be talking to you because your application would be in the trash. And signaling can explain what's going on here, which is even when you study something useless, something that you absolutely do not need to know on the job, still the fact that you did it and you jumped through these hoops shows a lot of good things about you. And especially it shows that you were a conformist person, that you went and followed the norms of our society. You did what your parents, teachers, and peers all said everyone has to do. Because if you're an employer, do you want to hire someone who doesn't do those things? I'd be nervous. I mean, I have a lot of nonconformist friends. I love them. They're fun. But if I were hiring people, I would be scared to hire those friends. I'd hire the boring people.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a safer bet to hire somebody who's got the credential than doesn't.
Yeah.
But you also make some serious claims about, there's just a lot of waste. So paint this picture for us. Where's all this waste and about how much of schooling is wasted? I mean, the subtitle of the book is The Education System is a Waste of Time and Money.
That's right.
Show me.
So my preferred number is 80% of the payoff for education is signaling, and it's basically just a waste of social resources. Doesn't mean it's a waste for the individual. The individual gets to look good and outshine the competition. But is it the kind of thing that it makes sense for taxpayers to encourage? And that's where I say no. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that you can come at this, and I say like all of these different ways point in the same basic, rough ballpark of the number. To me, probably the most impressive evidence is you just take a look at the amount of education that you need to get a job. Not do a job, but to get a job, to be considered worthy of employment. Since 1940, the amount of education that you need to get one and the same job that your dad or grandfather had back then has risen by about 3 years, almost a full degree. Right? So in 1940, there'd be almost no waiters or taxi drivers or cashiers with college degrees. It would have been almost unthinkable back then. Now these are very common jobs for people with college degrees to have. All right, and so like what's going on? I say what's going on is that the more education the workforce has, the more you need to impress employers. Like when almost nobody has even a high school degree, then if you have a high school degree, employers say, look at this person, this is management material. Now no one looks and sees that you finished high school and says management material. Now you might need to have not only a college degree, but an MBA. So, this is called credential inflation. It just means that, aside from the fact that jobs have changed, that's happened too, right? So there are some more intellectually demanding jobs, but that only explains a small part of what's going on. Most of what's gone on in the economy is that you now need a lot more education in order to be considered worthy of the very same jobs that people used to have in the past.
Right. So people, I hear a lot of folks saying, we have this new economy. It's a new economy. It's the future economy. So kids are going to need more and better education and newer education. Wrong, right?
Well, it would be nice if they were being trained for the new economy, but I don't see signs that schools are doing much of that at all. So again, the education system is normally extremely backwards looking. Teachers basically teach you the same things that they were taught when they were students. Their teachers did the same thing to them. If you look at the curriculum has barely changed over time. There's a little bit more time for computer science. Although, as far as I've heard, only Washington State lets high school students do a computer language instead of a foreign language. Right. All right, so there's almost no adaptation to what the modern economy is going to be. For say like, wow, like how can we even get by with this education system? And I say the answer is that almost all of the actual useful job training happens on the job. The main thing that you do with your education is not actually get ready to do a job. The main thing you do is convince employers that they could train you in the actual job that they want you to do. Right? Of course, you do learn some useful things in school, and there are some majors that are more vocational, so like nursing or medical school or engineers or computer scientists. But it's always important to remember that these are exceptions and that most students are doing majors in fields where there's almost no jobs at all. And then you're like, well, then where do they get jobs? They get jobs in something outside of their field. So, every year we graduate more new psychology BAs than there are jobs in psychology. Every year we graduate more communications BAs than there are jobs in the entire entertainment industry. So it's not like people in psychology and communications never get jobs. They just get a job where the employer says, I want someone with a college degree in something or other.
Right.
Right? And and the reason why the economy works is that when you finally get that job, then the employer says, well, did you learn how to do videography while doing psychology? No? Well, that's unfortunate, but none of your competitors know that either. All right, now let's go and do it. Or maybe you did an internship where you did, and then fine, you have an internship. That's useful, actually.
So let me ask you this. Does this system work for employers, and does it work well? I mean, if I'm on the hiring side, the demand side of the labor market, is it working?
Well, here's the main thing. There's about $1 trillion of government money in favor of the status quo every single year. So I wouldn't say the current system is passing the market test by any stretch of the imagination. It's propped up by enormous subsidies. And if government spent a lot less, there might be very different systems of figuring out who's good for jobs and who's bad for jobs. Probably be a lot more apprenticeships, probably be a lot of other kinds of certification. But at the same time, I don't see any sign that employers are really looking around very hard for something else. There are stories that people say, well, employers want to do other things, but it's illegal. I did look into this idea in the book. Like, for example, a lot of people say, well, employers would do IQ testing for hiring if it were only legal, but since that's illegal, they do college instead. So here's the striking thing. When I actually did research on this, found out that IQ testing is like 98% legal.
Yeah.
2% illegal, 98% legal.
Right.
And the amount of actual punishment that you are likely to receive in the legal system for doing IQ testing for hiring is peanuts compared to the cost savings. So I have to say that I don't think that employers are eager to switch to something else. And again, my story for this is that if you were to go and say we're hiring people that dropped out of high school but they have high IQs, I think you would get a certain kind of really smart person, namely lazy, nonconformist, defiant, smart people who are, again, I love them. A lot of these are my favorite people in the world, but I don't want to hire them.
Yeah, you don't want to depend on them.
Yeah, I don't want to depend on them. I want, I can depend upon them to be ready to go to a concert at a moment's notice. I say, hey, buddy, hey, smart, lazy friend, do you want to go to concert free tickets? You're like, dude, I'm up for that. So yeah, so those, like
depending on them to get your taxes done by April 15th.
Exactly. Them, I want the boring person.
Sure. I understand. So let me ask you a question. You're a little bit all over the map here on which level of education you're talking about. It sounds like you're talking about higher education, and I know that a lot of people would say, yeah, higher ed wastes a ton of money. So, but where does it stop? I mean, high school certainly is always a good investment, right?
Well, for the individual, then generally it pays very nicely.
Right.
But again, for society, I don't think so. So again, think about all the time that you wasted in high school, all the useless requirements, things that you had to do in order to graduate that you're never going to use again. I mean, it's just very striking if you make an inventory of all the time that you spend in high school studying subjects that you will never use after the final exam. Like massive foreign language requirement, 2 or 3 years, and yet almost no one in America learns to speak a foreign language very well in school.
Right.
All right, so history, civics, art, music, these are required classes to an insane extent.
Sure.
And yet if you don't jump through these hoops, then you are not going to be allowed to advance. You're not going to be allowed to get into college, and you're cutting off a lot of opportunities for yourself. So again, like one of the other things that I say in the book is be much better if kids, especially kids who just don't like school. There are a lot of kids like that. There are a lot of kids who are miserable, bored out of their minds. If kids like this could instead go and do vocational education, or they could do apprenticeships and be prepared for an actual job. It's very striking that there are countries like Germany and Switzerland where kids who just don't like school, never have, when they're 13 or 14 or 15, they can go and do vocational education.
But but we've got this education credential arms race. Mm-hmm. And with that background, right, for these kids, it's not a rational decision for them, right? I mean, the rational decision for them would be, look, if you drop out of high school, things are not going to go very well. Am I wrong?
So if you drop out of high school and do nothing, then you're totally right. If you quit high school and learn to be a plumber,
right,
especially if you're the kind of person who probably was going to quit high school anyway eventually,
right,
then I think there's actually very good evidence that the vocational track is a good idea for you. So the main idea of my book is just that taxpayers are wasting a lot of money encouraging this rat race. But I do also have the side idea that even in high school, there are a lot of kids, like maybe a third of kids or half of kids who would actually be even personally better off if parents would just listen to them and teachers listen to them and say, look, you don't want to do college. College is not the kind of thing that in any way inspires you.
Sure.
How about we go and teach you something else? And especially, people say, well, so you get tagged as a plumber at 13. I say, how about this? How about when you're 13, if you don't like school, we introduce you to 20 different occupations. 2 weeks as a plumber, 2 weeks as an electrician. Just try a bunch of things.
Right.
Is there anything you like and are good at all? Right? And I think there's a lot of 13-year-olds who would jump at that chance because they spent years of their life just being told, like, you're a C or a D student, you're not good at this stuff, shape up.
Yeah, interesting. So we've had actually the absolute polar opposite of that as far as sort of the dominant K-12 theme over the past decade. College for all, right? College for all. And we should design our education system to get everybody to graduate high school and everybody to go to college.
It sounds great.
How does this play? I mean, how does this play out? How do you see this playing out? If we were to succeed in that, what would we have?
If we were to actually get every kid to graduate from college, you would need a college degree to be a janitor. You need a college degree to be a waiter. and it would no longer be in any way impressive to employers. And so employers would then say you need to have a master's degree or a PhD or professional degree to be worthy of even being our intern. Right? So, I mean, like in a world where everyone has a college degree, then garbage men have college degrees.
Right.
Then, janitors have college degrees. This is a crazy system. Again, it's never going to happen, and we're nowhere close to it, just because even though about 70% of graduating high school seniors go on to college, but the actual rate of completion is much lower.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. I mean, even 2-year college, we're having 2/3 of our kids not make it through. And there certainly is a lot of ways. Let me push back on a couple of things. So
Sure thing.
when I was in graduate school, I learned hierarchical linear modeling. I'm just going to use this as an example because I TA'd it for several years. I taught it as an assistant. And man, I really knew every different way to run it. Today, I need to go back to my textbooks and sort of review some of my notes and sort of brush up on that. But in the book, you use lots of examples that are sort of akin to that. And I would say, well, I would not be able to go back and do HLM today without some review, but I can go back and do it. So in the book, you use examples like, well, a lot of kids could never pass an algebra test now. And my question is, isn't there
adults,
some... adults.
Right.
The test they could have passed when they were kids. So my question is, isn't there some value there that isn't being captured when you say, well, we've lost the discrete skills we had in 10th grade?
There's a small amount of value, so it's definitely true. Any educational psychologist will tell you it's easier to relearn than to learn the first time around.
Right.
But so much of what people forget is stuff they never use. It never comes up in adult life, and that's why they forget it. Actually, if you periodically brush up and refresh your memory, then at least you retain the basics, and yes, so it remains useful. But stuff I'm talking about is really stuff that really adults virtually never use. I mean, what's striking to me is that out of adults who actually went on to calculus as high school students, only about 20% even use algebra on the job right now.
Right.
So again, it's not like so we're training people something so that they can relearn it at each point when it becomes appropriate. Most of it is just stuff that you will never encounter again after the final exam. That's why we forget it so readily, is that we have no additional practice because what was taught was not really well thought out preparation for adult life.
So getting even past sort of the discrete skills that you can relearn, how about things that can't even be sort of communicated in skills? For instance, some people will say, well, part of getting through high school is just learn how to negotiate the system. And part of the problem with kids who drop out is they're never going to kind of learn to negotiate the kinds of systems that are going to give them success of any kind in the labor market. So without, if we roll back the education system substantially, are we prohibiting kids? Are we making it very hard for kids to learn how to negotiate those systems?
Right. So this is a classic compared to what question?
Right.
If it's either school or play video games home alone in your basement, then school is a great socializer, and I'll say nothing against it.
Right.
However, is that really the relevant alternative? In all other human societies and earlier in U.S. history, the alternative to school wasn't sitting home alone. The alternative was work. Right. And work also teaches people to negotiate systems, and it teaches social skills, teaches you how to get along with other people. But it also teaches a bunch of social skills that aren't really being taught very well in schools today, like accepting criticism. Right? In modern schools, they're so touchy-feely and they're so positive that kids often are not told, by the way, you screwed up, you are not, your work is inadequate and you need to improve. Sorry. Right? On the job, you still get that kind of thing right now. Yeah. So like on the job, you learn the idea of you have to make the customer happy. Right? And life is not equal or fair. These are lessons that are taught on every job.
Right.
School, on the other hand, you really are preparing them for this strange world that no adult experiences of equality and fairness.
Right.
So, better to go and prepare kids for the world they're actually going to be facing.
Right.
But again, of course, don't go and give them immediate shock therapy where you give them a boss who screams at them on the first day.
Right.
But, just to move them gradually to a realistic environment where people don't love you. Right? So teachers at least pretend to love the students. I mean, even at the high school level, they're so nice. But in terms of preparing people for adult life, people aren't going to be that nice afterwards. So you better get used to it.
Hey everyone, Thanks for watching part 1 of our discussion with Bryan Caplan. Part 2 picks up right where we left off here, so click the link to see the next part of the series.